When I was first asked to ruminate on this book, I said no. It's a book. And I've often felt that books just are not a good fit for the rumination format. And I've already kind of highlighted my reasons for thinking that, so I don't really feel the need to rehash those. I already talked about those back in the Empire Strikes Back video. Or, excuse me, the Heir to the Empire video. Forgive me, Heir to the Empire video. But I have finally relented because, in many ways, there are several things to talk about with regards to the Shadows of the Empire, ignoring the book. Shadows of the Empire was not just a book, after all. It was the game, of course, on the N64, the comic series. In fact, it was actually three separate comic series. They came out with a soundtrack. They almost got John Williams to do the soundtrack for this. There were toys, there were little collectible cards you can get, and they actually produced what is effectively a movie trailer for this. Now, that trailer was eventually pulled. In fact, I myself have never seen it, to my dismay. And from my understanding, I actually went trying to go digging for it and couldn't find a good copy of it. I found a few copies of some of the things within it, but not the actual video itself. Fun fact, the trailer was apparently pulled because there was some concern that people thought they were actually going to be making Shadows of the Empire, the movie. My reason for bringing this up, though, is that it is most often stated that Shadows of the Empire, the multimedia thing, was what caused the special edition to happen. That's not 100% true, though. At least, I have to add, in my estimation. We don't know for 100% certainty. But it is my estimation that this was more testing the waters. The Star Wars EU had certainly been doing well at the time. Plenty of books had been coming out. In terms of the overall chronology, I believe it was just the previous year when Darksaber came out, which is set quite a bit after Return of the Jedi. So that's how far along the EU's storyline had gotten. It almost fully wrapped up, actually. There were only a handful of books after that leading up to the conclusion of the EU, aka the Hand of Thrawn duology, which then led into the Yuzun Vong thing after that, and so forth and so on. Point being, though, even though the EU was going strong, the original Star Wars things had only been touched on briefly and in only a few places here or there. For the most part, all this stuff that the EU was covering was stuff after, and in a few rare cases, much, much before. The prequel era, of course, was still untouched. That hadn't happened yet. And this pretty much perfectly bridged the gap between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. In fact, it literally begins during Empire Strikes Back and ends as they are on approach to Jabba's palace, just before Return of the Jedi. That's the significance of the bridge here. I personally think that this was them testing the waters, trying to see how receptive the public would be towards the special edition, and seeing how much support it would receive. Now, whether or not the special edition was well received is going to depend wildly based on who you ask. Some people think they're awesome, some people think they're terrible, and there's literally every in-between opinion. I've heard them all. Now, before we go any further, I want to mention the two things I didn't like about this book. I at once like and dislike Steve Perry as an author. I've read quite a bit of his stuff. He's good at certain types of dialogue, and he's really good at setting a scene. He's good at banter. There's a lot of really good banter and lighthearted moments in this book, despite the very serious nature of it. He's also good at really digging into a character from a first-person perspective. A lot of the book is told from both Shizor and from Vader's perspectives, and so we get to actually see what they are thinking and really, dig into their characters. But he does nevertheless have a kind of an odd writing style that at certain times I'll see a sentence and I'll tilt my head because it literally doesn't make sense to me why that would happen there. And it's just oddities, every now and again. But if I'm being completely honest, the other reason I don't like Steve Perry is because he puts too much sex in his books. I'm just going to put that out there. This is probably the most PG thing I've ever seen him write, Shadows of the Empire. And if you've read this book, you know why saying that is kind of hilarious given the content. Now, in fairness, most of the sexual content of Shadows of the Empire revolves around Shizor himself and is actually a part of his character. So it's not like it's wasted. It's just not something I would rather have seen in my book. It's hard to talk about most of the characters in this, because most of them are characters I've already kind of talked about. Lando I've already talked about, Luke I've already talked about, Leia, Chewie, R2, and 3PO. All of them are basically the same characters. Wedge is here too. All of them are the same generally basic characters that I've already talked about and I've already discussed back during the movie ruminations. I don't really have that much to add to them. I mean, Lando is still awesome. Luke is still learning. I'll talk about the Bothan mission in a bit. Leia is actually shown really well. There's a lot of first-person perspective from Leia's perspective as well. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the camera, so to speak, never goes into Lando's mind, and it never goes into Chewie's, or Dash's for that matter. But it goes in, and it never goes into Guri's either. But it goes into Luke's, Leia's, Vader's, and Shizor's several times throughout the course of the work. That's the perspectives we perceive the tale from. Excuse me. Leia, though, one of the things I like that they did with Leia is she is definitely, the strong leadership, I am the leader of the rebellion kind of a person, and yet underneath that we see someone who is uncertain, someone who is pretending to know more than she is because she knows that's what's required of the situation. I'm reminded most of something over in Star Trek The Next Generation, as weird as that sounds. The episode, the two-part of Chains of Command, where Captain Jellicoe has this scene where he gives, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it, and he seems very confident, very sure of himself, and he walks out and Riker says, well, at least he's very sure of himself, and Troy responds, no, he's not. And that one line adds so much depth to Jellicoe as a character, because it's the same way here with Leia. She knows from experience you have to, at the very least, pick something and adhere to it. You have to, if you don't know what you're doing, you still have to command. If you're the one in charge, you still have to lead, even if you don't really know what you're doing, even if you're not certain, even if you're not sure you're making the right call. That's part of what being a leader is. And seeing that conflict from her perspective was actually a nice touch. On top of that, we have Palpatine, who is surprisingly fleshed out in this one, despite his relatively small role in the work. We see a lot of Palpatine through his absence, his connections, his reach, his information. He is completely ahead of everyone all of the time. There is no one who at any point in time is in any way ahead of him, information-wise, or in terms of their machinations or politics. And he has absolutely no hesitation about, to use the words that the book itself uses, cracking the whip from now and again. But it also emphasizes something about EU Palpatine, which is different from AU Palpatine, in that Palpatine, Emperor Palpatine, in many ways didn't want a perfectly running government at the top. The reasons why vary and are a little bit up to interpretation. For example, on the one hand, you could say he wanted to ensure his position at the top. On the other hand, it is also valid, and indeed doesn't even contrast the first part, that he wanted the people who crawled to the top of the rung to be too busy constantly undercutting each other to ruin the Empire. Now, of course, that didn't work out because of Tarkin, but you get the idea. In other words, promote beyond the point at which they can affect things, kind of a situation. Regardless of motives, we see very clearly in this that Palpatine has absolutely no problem literally arranging situations on purpose so that Shizor and Vader are rivals, are antagonistic towards each other. And he actually gives Shizor several political benefits and points, basically, information that he wouldn't otherwise have, just to try and even the scores, because, let's be honest, Vader would crush Shizor like a bug, even politically. But I'll get more into that later. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with Rogue One? If you have to actually ask that, then I've got nothing else for you. I hope the movie's good, by the way. I'm recording this in advance. Obviously, Rogue One has not come out today from my perspective. It's come out today from your perspective. So tomorrow, your tomorrow, not my tomorrow, hopefully we'll be discussing that in stream. Hopefully, fingers crossed. I mean, that's the schedule, but things can always go wrong with that. So I hope to see you there when we talk about that. This book is ultimately about Shizor and Vader. This is their story. The entirety of this book really revolves around those two people. While Luke undergoes a fairly large amount of character development and character growth, and understanding of the Force and understanding of himself throughout the book, and Leia certainly has the spotlight a lot of the time. The core themes and the core elements of this book, in my opinion, of course, revolve around those two antagonistic characters. Now, the interesting thing about Shizor and about Vader is, in many ways, they are alike. Almost identical, actually. They're both very powerful individually, personally powerful. They're both very powerful politically. They are both people who are sitting at the top of the heap. The comment is made more than once that, there's the Emperor, then there's Vader, then there's Shizor. I don't actually buy that, by the way, but regardless, Shizor and Vader are, at the very least, in the top crust of the galaxy, and there's no denying that. And these two can have whatever they want and however they want it, and they can order people around tons and tons of things, and yet Despite all of those things, these are two extremely different men, and their differences and the contrast between the two drives much of the book. There are. I don't know what order to talk about things in here. I've got my notes are kind of a mess because it's a book, and I've. But oh, you notice I'm not really talking about Dash Rendar. Hang on, let me. I have literally only one note about Dash Rendar. It's actually technically three notes. Dash Rendar, in my opinion, is Han Solo as he could have become if something hadn't tempered him. If he hadn't encountered Chewbacca, for example, and helped him. If he hadn't ended up joining the Alliance and interacting with Luke and Leia. If he hadn't basically grown as a character and he had just stayed as he was, he would have become Dash Rendar. Because what is one thing that is very true about both Han Solo and Dash Rendar is that they are good. I don't mean good people. I mean they're good at what they do. They're skilled. Now, when you are really, really skilled at something, you tend to get confident. You have confidence that you keep doing it. And it's very easy under the wrong circumstances for that confidence to boil over into complete prideful arrogance. Han Solo certainly had a lot of confidence, but even he was tempered by the mistakes that had been made even prior to A New Hope. And by, Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo had flat out started to recognize how bad things could get and how invested he could become. Rendar didn't have any of that. He lost everything, and that basically forced him to cut all ties, and he just went off and said, well, screw it, and that's pretty much the extent of his character. It isn't until the Bothan Incident that he actually recognizes the cost of arrogance. The cost of arrogance is another one of those underlying themes throughout the whole work. The fact that almost every time any character fails at something, or something goes wrong, or worse, it's because overconfidence happened. Probably the best example of this is when Luke successfully, at great effort, at great length, manages to Jedi mind trick the gentleman to go in while he's being held by the bounty hunters, manages to escape, and then manages to get his gear, and he says, wow, this is easy. Immediately after he steps into that overconfidence thing, into that arrogance line, that's when things go wrong. And this is true throughout the whole book. There's dozens of examples. I'm just giving you one of them. But I mentioned the Bothan Incident because that's another one of the undercurrent themes in the book, in my opinion. I shouldn't say it like that. I have talked with one person in the past, this was years ago, who argued that this was a book about the variance between the rich and the poor. I think that that's close but not accurate enough to really get across the nuance of what this book is going for, which is the difference between those on the top and the difference between those in the bottom. This is everywhere, actually, in the whole book. I started writing down examples, but it just kept going and going and going until I stopped writing down every single example. The book constantly shifts perspectives between, oh God, desperately fighting for our lives, or living in a scum pit, or being imprisoned, to carefully trimming 1,000-year-old tree, or enjoying a nice meal, or laying back in the bath and enjoying it. And then it cuts back to, oh God, we're barely surviving. But that's more of the obvious stuff. One of my favorite, more subtle examples of the contrast between those at the top and those at the bottom is the Bothan Incident, and that's the one I really want to talk about. That moment is actually a big character moment for both Luke and Rendar, but also, in many ways, is the fulcrum point of the entire book. And, of course, is a moment of great significance for Star Wars as a whole. That is the moment in which they finally discovered the plans for the Death Star 2, on the behest, of course, of Palpatine and Shizor. There's some argument and contradictions as to whether it was all Shizor's thought. Like, I believe the game makes it a point that it was completely Shizor's idea, or if Palpatine had any say in that, it doesn't matter. Point being, the significance, though, is in that battle, several Bothans died. I forget the exact number, forgive me. Dash Rendar is brutalized by it. He actually goes into legitimate shell shock, battle shock, from the loss of those Bothans and his own failure. And it is his turning point as a character, his A New Hope moment, basically, in the Han Solo XP that he is. And for Luke, it is a massive moment. It's a moment in which he realizes his limitations. He can bear his difficulties in functioning as a commander, something he has clear aspirations to. He wants to be a general. He wants to be, this great general of the rebellion, and then every time he tries to lead, he loses people. This has been true throughout his entire character arc, from A New Hope up until now, actually, if you're paying attention. He's always lost people on his missions, and he has a very hard time accepting that, which is funny because so did his dad, if you'll remember. His dad, Anakin, in some of his only good characterization, was one of the extremely few people who actually felt, actually disliked losing clone troopers. Most of the other Jedi and generals were just like, yeah, they're clones, expendable, and didn't even give them a second thought. Anakin was one of the few people who actually cared when he lost people. Nice little touch there. But regardless, this ties into the overall theme of the book or the second theme of the book, I should say, because for the little guys, for the guys at the bottom, for Luke, for Rendar, and for, oh God, I can't think of the name of the Bothan involved, that was a significant cost in a costly battle that they barely succeeded at. And then, not too long after, we cut to Shizor and Palpatine, and it's nothing to them. It's a token thing. We just wanted to make sure you had to fight for it. We didn't want to make it too easy. For them, all the lives lost and all the effort put into it means nothing. And then they casually send an SSD, 2 VSDs, and an ISD. Yes, I remember the ships, of course. I can't remember the names, but I can remember the ships. They send a Doom fleet. That's a fleet that could wipe out a planet without effort, by the way, to go wipe out some piddling little shipyard. Oh, wait, hang on. I'm mistaking it. Never mind. I'm sorry. I'm mistaking it. That's the fleet that went after the Aurora shipyards. That's not the fleet that went after... Anyways, the point being, they do send the SSD. They send the Executor. I know that for a fact. Sorry. They send the Executor. So my point is still valid. They send a frickin' SSD to just casually wipe out some base that may or may not have had rebel connections, just to increase the validity of the lie. It's the cost variance there. To the little guys, that was a costly battle. And indeed, the Bothan himself died to the bounty hunter attack shortly thereafter. And yet... And I have to point out, Luke's refusal to leave his troops is also what leads to him being captured. I mean, that worked out in the end, but only thanks to Lando and some luck, let's be blunt. He probably should have run, like the Bothan told him to, but regardless, that's not the kind of person Luke is, just like his dad. But the point is that cost variance. Let me give you another example, because this helps tie into Shizor's character. There's a scene... Let me actually rewind just a bit here. Let me check my notes. Hang on. Let me actually not go into the next example yet. Let me just talk about Shizor in a vacuum. He's very cold and calculating, of course, but he strikes me, if anything, and I don't mean this as a negative way, he strikes me as very Vulcan. Someone who has extremely powerful, passionate emotions, and yet keeps them under very tight control the majority of the time, so that he is tempering himself with logic to the point where even though he still has those emotions, they do not rule him. And yet we do know that they do in fact affect him, affect his mindset, affect his growth. I'm building up to a point here. I'll get to it. Several scenes are written to show the extreme opulence in which Shizor lives in. Now these are great scenes. They're very well written. Like I said, Steve Perry knows how to set a scene. So on the one hand, the scenes and all the things that he enjoys in his life are awe-inspiring. It's the kind of things that you're supposed to just look at and go, wow. If it was a movie, for example, you're just supposed to gasp in awe and appreciation for it. But then that immediately puts us into contrast with Shizor's character himself, who has no appreciation for the opulence he enjoys. And then, because we have such a different reaction to how Shizor is reacting to this opulence, we are then filled with the next emotion, or at least we are intended to be filled with the next emotion that was designed to be evoked within us, disgust at the fact that he looks at this and he has no appreciation, no gratitude, no anything. He's just, yep. To Shizor, he is another part of that arrogant overconfidence thing I mentioned earlier. For him, the best is normal. That's what should be. That's what he deserves. That is what is his due. That's what he should have every single day of his life. He should be able to walk around on a bed of his own followers bowing down before him, and he would find that normal. He would barely even appreciate it. He would barely even acknowledge it. Now, I mentioned the political and personal power thing. One thing I do think that is an interesting contrast between Shizor and Vader. Both of them have political power. Both of them have personal power. Shizor is an excellent martial artist who is very much in good shape, blah, blah, blah. And Vader, of course, is freaking Darth Vader, arguably one of the biggest death machines in the setting in any time period. Regardless, though, Vader leans more towards personal power. Obviously, he is stronger. He would just demolish Shizor in a one-on-one fight. But that's not what I mean. I mean, his mentality leans more towards personal power. He prefers personal power. To him, all this politicking and all this spy game stuff, well, that's extra. That's stuff he has to do because he has to. And I'll talk more about Vader later. But he really wants to be the person who stands in front of an army and just says, come on, bring it. Shizor can do that, but he doesn't want to. He prefers the political power. He prefers to be the person who's manipulating things and making gestures and making suggestions and playing with information and doing all of those gray, ill-defined things that political power means. This is most strongly demonstrated, in my opinion, when Jabba comes to call to Shizor's palace. Now, for those of you not firmly familiar with the EU, let me go and just tell you something right now. Although certain sources disagree because the EU is not completely, free of plot holes and contradicting information, Jabba's organization was, at the very least, one of the strongest criminal organizations in the entire galaxy. Some sources put it as the strongest criminal organization in the galaxy. And in fact, I have heard several sources and several people discuss whether or not Jabba or all of Black Sun was stronger. And the fact that Jabba could probably match, the fact that there was even a contest, that Jabba's group, his cartel, just Jabba, not the rest of the Hutts, just Jabba, was strong enough to match Black Sun, said a lot for where Jabba sat on the totem pole. And yet, Shizor can literally command Jabba to speak basic, which Jabba then does without hesitation. This is, again, going back to that political power thing. Now, again, Jabba has a lot of personal power. I mean, he can hold his own in a fight quite well. He could probably beat Shizor in a one-on-one fight if no blasters were involved. Maybe even if they were. But he values political power more than personal power, just like Shizor does. So he knows how to play the game, in other words. The few, as Steve Perry likes to call it. That's part of his other book series, too, if you ever read them. He likes to give the right information and give the right nod and be the kind of person who can use the thought of, I have the ear of Black Sun, to increase his own prestige and political power. So he is willing to be commanded by Black Sun, or he is sufficiently cowed by Black Sun. Both interpretations are valid, but both really emphasize that political aspect of Shizor's personality. Now, one other little bit of note. Well, actually, let me go ahead and jump forward really quick. Shizor, at one point, I mentioned the lack of appreciation Shizor has. Probably nowhere is this best emphasized by how he treats Guri, or Juri. I've actually heard both pronunciations. I'm not sure which it's supposed to be. I've always thought of her as Guri, though, so forgive me. Guri is probably, she's the Data of Star Wars. I don't mean that as an insult. I mean, well, actually, she's even more the Data, because at least there's Data, Lore, and B4, and the Mother, and I think that's it. But there's only one Guri. She is the only HRD. The only one. And the odds of there being another one like her are basically not existent. The possibility exists that someone might make something similar to her, but she is unique and very capable, very competent, very loyal. You know, she's basically his best tool in every way. And yet, he treats her as if she is little more than a tool. He appreciates her. She's probably the only thing he does appreciate. And yet he still, despite the extent of his appreciation, only extends as far as his own logic allows it to. Shizor is the kind of man who will legitimately consider ordering one of his most valuable resource into a death match against Darth Vader for the entertainment value. Now, he won't actually do that. His logic demands that that would be a bad choice to make. It would be a bad calculation. But the kind of person he is under that logic is the kind of person who would contemplate it. Would that be entertaining to watch? And that, I think, is the real core of why Shizor is a despicable individual. It's not just his effective usage of women as toys, which is disgusting. It's not the fact that he treats all of his people as if they were units on a game board. Well, I mean, we've seen tons of villains do that. It's not the fact that he's the head of some big criminal empire. I mean, whoop-de-crap, the Emperor's worse than that. No, it is the fact that he's a giant fraud. Hear me out. Xizor is someone who pretends that he is better than everyone. In his mind, it is absolutely inevitable that he will rule the entire galaxy someday. That he will usurp Emperor Palpatine. This is in spite of the fact that Xizor is one of the few individuals well positioned enough to understand just how powerful, personally and politically, that Emperor Palpatine is. And yet he still considers that an absolute that will happen. He is the kind of person who is so full of himself, and yet he has no actual strong core under that. His logic, to use the Vulcan equivalent, his cold, calculating persona, is just a shell. Every time anything goes wrong with his situation at all, it doesn't work out right. He loses control of himself. He allows himself to be brought into a personal vendetta against Vader, to go against the second most powerful individual in the galaxy, and I don't think there's anyone who can contest that at this point in era. Or some would argue Vader's actually the most powerful, but let's not get into that. One of the two most powerful men in the galaxy, as a personal vendetta. Not a calculated blow against him. Not, I wish to remove him because he is an opponent. It's personal. This is someone who allows his pride at being rejected to overwhelm him. This is someone who allows his anger at the situation to bypass his thinking. This is someone who is, at his core, underneath all of that shell, an absolute monster, who is very emotional, who is very unchecked, and who is very unsure of himself. Read the book. Seriously, I do recommend it. It's a good book. Read the book. We go into his perspective, into his mind. He is constantly reaffirming to himself that he is better, that he is smarter. I am smarter. I am superior. I am better. I am better. They're worse. They're worse. I am better. I am superior. It's constant, nonstop, every scene he's in. He is constantly reaffirming to himself that he is the superior of all these people around him, that they are pathetic beneath him, that even Vader, Darth freaking Vader, is just another hot-blooded mammal beneath him. I don't think he believes a word of that. Or I should say, I don't think any of that... There's actually a term for this. It's called a seared conscience. It's when you tell yourself something so much that you believe it. And I don't mean like, I believe, man. I mean, it becomes an inherent truth to your being. But it's still a damn lie. And that's the problem with Xizor. He is not superior. He is a fraud. And that brings me to Vader. On the surface of it, like I said, I started off with this. Xizor and Vader are very similar to each other. And yet, when you really look at the book, the two men almost couldn't be more unalike from each other. We see in this book, Vader is definitely evil. Don't mistake that. But this is a man who has beliefs in honor, in duty, in doing what is right, in supporting, in just an overall a code of honor. And I don't mean like external honor or fake honor, as I like to call it. I mean internal honor. He prefers to adhere himself to a code. There's a great line about how he plays the game and plays it well, but he does not like it. I love that line, too, because that also emphasizes the part of Anakin Skywalker still in him. I know that sounds weird, but the Anakin Skywalker that should be and is in some of the EU works is a man who doesn't like doing, say, B. Whatever B is, it doesn't matter. It's some activity. He hates doing it, and yet he will apply himself fully to doing the best job he can at it, because that's just the kind of person he is. Anakin Skywalker does not do things half-assed. He charges in full tilt and puts his full effort into it. And so Darth Vader is very politically powerful. He has a tremendous spy network. He knows how to play the game of discreetness and politicking and all that fun stuff. He just hates it. But the whole time we see underneath that so many interesting layers. This is, in my opinion, the best look at Vader we ever see in all of the EU. Um, there's so many things. I wrote down a couple of notes here really quick, just to jot out some things. So first of all, the fact that he actually felt. There's actually a line, something along the lines of, the encounter with his son made him feel, a rare occurrence of late. And when he's fighting these dueling droids, so much effort is put into the work, in the book, to emphasize that these dueling droids are amazing and powerful and deadly and fast and strong. And Vader is effortlessly, and without even giving attention to it, obliterating them. Just completely curb stomping the dueling droids. And in the back of the line, there's always this little tidbit. His shoulder definitely felt better. That line is brilliant in how understated it is. Because for these amazing, skilled, designed for combat droids can't even touch him, and yet his son managed to score one hit, or maybe it was on the right shoulder, I forget, but anyways, on his shoulder during Empire Strikes Back. And that matters to him. And then it's just further emphasized when he goes out on the fleet, where he actually took the SSD, the two VSDs, and the ISD, the fleet I mistook earlier. When he goes to wipe out the shipyards, the Aurora shipyards for the Rebel Alliance, and he goes out in his personal TIE, his TIE Advanced, and he just starts effortlessly playing them out. And it's like, yes, I'm flying, and this is. He is casually obliterating every single pilot he's fighting. And then there's this great part where he's got someone in his sights, and he could destroy him. That life is his to destroy. He breaks away in disgust. Not out of pity, not out of sense of good, because this is beneath him. This is how Vader and Shizor are similar, and yet at the same time completely different. Shizor thinks he is superior to everyone. Vader is. Think about it. I'm not trying to lick Vader's boots or say he's perfect or anything, but Vader is so much higher than everyone else on almost every scale. Financially, politically, in terms of his fighting skill, in terms of the military he has at his command, in terms of his personal combat. He doesn't even need his lightsaber, really, to actually be able to take down, however many bodyguards or droids or whatever. He is on top of the heap in almost every way. And this is how Vader brings that first theme all the way back to the beginning. Because we see very clearly the sharp contrast between Luke, for example, and Shizor. One at the top, one at the bottom, right? Probably my favorite example of this, and I've been saving this because this is the point I was building up to, is one of the points I was building up to. Shizor doesn't have to work for anything. He effortlessly just, yes, do this. I mean, there's a scene where someone walks in and says, "We would like to offer you alliance. Please, please, please." No, 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 lick boots, lick boots. That's not actually what happens, but because the person coming is one of his agents. But the tone from the person who sent the message is, "Oh, God, please give us an alliance." And they offer him a multi-million credit ruby, which he casually tosses onto his desk, and if it fell to the floor, who cares? Shizor has everything handed to him. He doesn't have to try or work at anything. And none of his accomplishments mean anything. He says he's not bored. And yet at the same time, he says that right out. And yet his overall presentation is of someone who has no interest in anything around him. That lack of appreciation I mentioned earlier. By contrast, Luke Skywalker spends over a month building a lightsaber. And we see, and now that's just a sentence. That doesn't mean much, but Steve Perry does something brilliant, and he devotes several sections of the book to Luke's working on that lightsaber, so that we, the reader, see Luke putting lots of effort and work and time and care into this relatively minor and insignificant task. He's just building a lightsaber. It's not that big of a deal. And yet, Luke really cares about doing this, and when he succeeds, and he finally has built his first lightsaber, he's ecstatic. This means something to him. He has succeeded at this, and he is exuberant. He is overjoyed at this success. And you see the contrast between Luke, who accomplished a minor thing that took him a month, compared to Shizor, who accomplishes galaxy-wide altering things on a daily basis, and it means nothing to him. And this is where Vader comes into this. Because Vader, who is superior, who actually does work for what he does, who constantly tries to push himself and fails because no one else can push back hard enough for him to have to try that much, is the outcast in all of this. Vader is the person who would be more comfortable striving like his son did and then relishing in the success rather than sitting at the top of the heap like his counterparts of Shizor and the Emperor, actually. He doesn't want to be at the top of the heap, not really. And that contrast really helps to mark Vader as an individual and really helps to separate him from basically everyone else in the story. He is at the top, like Shizor, but he's not. He is like his son at the bottom, but he's not. He truly doesn't belong in any case. And I cannot deny that I think this was done on purpose. Probably for a more mundane reason. Probably for the whole Anakin Skywalker reason. The book flat out calls out the fact that he still has Anakin Skywalker in him. That he has the light side in him. And that is what he considers to be a weakness. And yet, in addition to that fact, I feel like this helps to singularly identify Vader as his own person. I've said before that Darth Vader is one of the most well-designed villains in history. And I stand by that statement. But I have to be honest, a lot of that comes from things that aren't just the movies. And this book is a big example of why. And I have to add one last note here right at the end. It is incredibly amusing to me that Vader is someone who is so impatient. Patience is not one of his strong suits. They say that like 10 times in the book. And he just wants to do things and he wants to get things done. He's a man of action. And yet the one thing in the whole book he is willing to be patient about, he is willing to have patience and to take it slowly and to do it properly, the one thing he's willing to put a month of effort into slow, not literally a month, but I mean, he is willing to put the time and effort and care into this project, just like Luke did with his lightsaber, and this project is his son. It's the only thing that Vader still really cares about. And it's a brilliant, brilliant analysis of his character. I hope this rumination was not too disappointing. I hope the movie was good today, and I hope I'll see you next time.